Harlem, New York, winter of 1947, a city wrapped in ice, silence, and invisible suffering. While America was celebrating victory after the war, entire neighborhoods were quietly freezing, starving, and being forgotten. In the middle of that frozen afternoon, a single moment unfolded that no newspaper would headline at the time, but decades later, it would come to be remembered as one of the most shocking human stories ever linked to Bumpy Johnson. This is not a story about power, money, or crime. It begins with an elderly woman standing alone in the middle of a Harlem street, wearing a thin house dress in sub-zero wind, her face bruised, her body shaking, and her hands raised not in defiance, but in desperation. She wasn't asking for protection. She wasn't asking for justice. She wasn't asking for revenge. She was asking for one thing only: a single loaf of bread. What happened next shocked everyone who later heard the story. Because instead of violence, instead of fear, instead of the brutality Harlem expected from its most feared man, what followed was something far more unsettling: compassion, intervention, and a chain reaction that would quietly save two lives and redefine how one ruthless gangster was remembered. This is the true story of the day: an old woman stopped Bumpy Johnson's car, and how that single moment changed everything. Harlem, New York. Tuesday afternoon, February 4th, 1947. The clock read 4:37 p.m. The temperature hovered around 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind sliced through coats and scarves like blades. Bumpy Johnson sat in the back seat of his black Cadillac as it turned onto Lenox Avenue, heading toward his office above the Palm Cafe, another routine moment in a city where he controlled entire blocks with a word. But suddenly, the driver slowed to a crawl. Standing directly in the middle of the street was an elderly woman who refused to move. She didn't step aside. She didn't flinch at the horn. She simply stood there, arms wrapped tightly around herself, wearing nothing but a thin, faded house dress and worn slippers, no coat, no protection against the brutal February cold. Her gray hair was uncombed, whipped by the wind, and on her left cheek was a dark, swollen bruise, fresh enough to still carry a deep purple hue. When the driver honked again, she finally lifted her head and looked straight at the back window of the Cadillac. She raised one trembling hand, not in threat, not in anger, but in a silent, desperate plea, the kind of gesture made by someone who had reached the very end of her options. Inside the car, Johnson's bodyguard, William "Bub" Hewlett, stiffened instantly, his hand drifting toward the .45 tucked under his coat. In Harlem, stopping a man like Bumpy Johnson in the street was exactly how assassinations began. He had survived attempts before. Every unexpected moment was dangerous. But Johnson raised his hand, calmly signaling Bub to stand down, and told the driver to stop. The window rolled down, letting the icy air flood the car. "Ma'am," Johnson said evenly, his voice steady, "you're standing in the middle of the street in freezing weather without a coat. What's going on? Do you need help?" The woman began to move toward the car, slowly, painfully, as if every step cost her strength she barely had left. Up close, Johnson could see how badly she was shaking, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion. Her words came out broken, stuttering between breaths. She told him she knew who he was. Everyone in Harlem did. She apologized for stopping his car, but said she had no other choice. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. Her electricity had been shut off for a week. Her heat had been cut for 10 days. She was living alone in a freezing apartment with no power, no food, and no money. She had come out onto the street with one hope: that if she could find him, maybe he would help her. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't asking for protection. She was begging for one thing only: a single loaf of bread so she could eat. Johnson stared at her in silence. She was likely in her 70s, her face carved by decades of poverty and hardship. Her dress had been washed so many times it was nearly threadbare. This wasn't a scam. This wasn't someone trying to work an angle. This was a Harlem grandmother who was starving and freezing in her own home, so desperate that she had risked her life by stepping in front of the most feared man in the neighborhood just to survive another day. Something shifted inside Johnson, something rare, something uncomfortable. 30 years in crime had hardened him, built a shield of indifference. But this cut straight through it. "Get in the car," he finally said, opening the door. "You're going to freeze to death out here." "Wilong 23. The woman hesitated, fear flickering across her face. Getting into a car with Bumpy Johnson and his armed bodyguard was terrifying, but the cold was worse. She climbed inside, and the warmth immediately broke her composure. She began to cry, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet sobs of someone who had been holding on for far too long. Johnson removed his own expensive camel hair overcoat and draped it over her shoulders. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked gently. "Elizabeth Carter," she replied, her teeth chattering. And as the car pulled away from Lenox Avenue, Johnson had no idea that this simple answer was about to draw him into a story far darker and far more personal than he ever expected. As the Cadillac moved through the frozen streets of Harlem, Elizabeth Carter sat quietly in the back seat, wrapped in Bumpy Johnson's overcoat, her hands trembling as the warmth slowly returned to her body. The relief only made the reality sink in harder. Between soft sobs, she began to speak, not because she wanted to tell her story, but because years of silence had finally cracked. She gave her address, 347 West, 134th Street, apartment 4B, and then, almost apologetically, she explained who she was. 72 years old. Living in Harlem for more than 4 decades, ever since she came up from Virginia in 1904. For most of her life, she worked as a domestic servant for white families downtown, cleaning their homes, raising their children, doing back-breaking labor for wages so small they barely counted. When she became too old to work 5 years earlier, there was nothing waiting for her. No pension, no savings, no safety net, just survival. She told him the numbers, and those numbers hit harder than anything else, she said. The city welfare office gave her $11 a month. Her rent was $8. That left her $3 to cover food, electricity, heat, medicine, everything a human being needed to stay alive. $3. She said she had managed somehow, scraping by week after week, but this winter had been different. Colder, longer, crueler. First, the electric company shut off her power when she fell behind. Then the landlord cut her heat, claiming she owed back rent. She had been sitting alone in her apartment, wrapped in blankets that did nothing, growing weaker by the day. By Sunday, the food was gone. By Tuesday, she couldn't feel her fingers. That was when she stepped outside and waited, hoping against reason that she might find anyone who would help. Johnson listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. He had grown up poor. He understood hunger. But hearing it reduced to exact numbers, $3 a month, forced him to confront the cruelty of it in a way violence never had. Sitting in a heated Cadillac, wearing a coat worth hundreds of dollars, a diamond ring on his finger, having collected thousands in gambling profits that very morning, the contrast was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just poverty. This was a system quietly letting elderly people die. And then there was the bruise. Dark, swollen, unmistakable. Johnson had seen enough violence in his life to recognize it instantly. That mark didn't come from a fall. It came from a hand. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully, his voice still calm but firmer now. "That bruise on your face, how did you get it?" She looked down, ashamed, and tried to dismiss it. Said she fell, said it was nothing. Johnson didn't raise his voice, but something cold settled into it. He told her he knew the difference between an accident and a beating. Slowly, the truth came out. Through tears and broken sentences, Elizabeth admitted it was her son, Edward, 43 years old, an alcoholic, drinking since he was 17, losing every job he ever had, sleeping in the streets or cheap flop houses when he could afford them. He came to her apartment, asking for money to buy liquor, and when she told him she had nothing, he became angry. 2 nights earlier, he showed up at 3 a.m, drunk beyond reason. When she refused him again, he hit her, knocked her to the floor, hurt her hip. Then he searched her apartment until he found the single dollar she had hidden away for emergencies and took it before leaving her alone in the cold. As she spoke, Johnson's expression changed. His bodyguard noticed it instantly. It was the same look Johnson had worn before dealing with men who crossed lines even the criminal world didn't tolerate. Hitting elderly people, exploiting the helpless, crimes that stirred something deeper than business. But when Johnson spoke again, his voice remained controlled. Instead of asking what Edward had done, he asked who Edward used to be, what kind of man he had been before alcohol destroyed him. Elizabeth wiped her eyes and told him about a boy who was smart, good with numbers, proud to finish high school when so few black boys did. A boy who wanted to be a teacher, a young man who took whatever work he could find because the world offered him nothing better. Dock work, factory jobs, janitorial work. Long hours, low pay, constant humiliation. Somewhere along the way, the drinking stopped being occasional and became everything. Still, she said, sometimes, just sometimes, she saw flashes of the sun she raised, and that made it hurt even more. Johnson reached into his wallet and pulled out 5 $20 bills, $100. He placed them gently into her shaking hands. She stared at the money as if it were unreal, more than she had seen in years. She tried to refuse, saying she only asked for bread. Johnson cut her off, firm but not unkind. He told her exactly what to do: pay the electric bill that day, settle with the landlord so the heat would come back on, buy a proper coat and shoes, buy real groceries, get medicine for her injured hip. Whatever was left, she was to keep for herself. This wasn't charity, he told her. It was payment long overdue for a lifetime of work no one had ever fairly rewarded. Then his tone hardened again. She was not to give a single dollar to her son. Not one. That money was to keep her alive. If Edward came asking, she was to say no. And if he caused trouble again, she was to send word to him at the Palm Cafe. He promised her she didn't have to be afraid anymore. As the driver prepared to take her home, Johnson told her one final thing: he was going to handle the situation with her son. And with that decision, something far more dangerous than generosity was set into motion. After the Cadillac pulled away, carrying Elizabeth Carter back toward her freezing apartment, Bumpy Johnson didn't return to his office. He stepped out onto the sidewalk instead, pulling his coat tighter as the winter wind cut through 125th Street. He turned to his bodyguard and said quietly that they were taking a walk, 6 blocks south, toward 133rd Street, toward the alley behind Cohen's liquor store, the place where men who had nowhere else to go gathered when they managed to scrape together enough money for a bottle. Elizabeth had told him that was where her son usually ended up, and Johnson believed her. The walk was silent. Not the comfortable silence of routine, but the kind that comes when something inevitable is about to happen. Bub Hewlett had seen this mood before. It wasn't rage in the explosive sense. It was colder than that, controlled, focused. The kind of anger that didn't burn out, it carried through, all the way to consequences. The alley looked exactly as Elizabeth had described: narrow, filthy, littered with broken glass and garbage, the kind of place sunlight barely touched even on a clear day. 4 men sat on overturned crates and cardboard, passing cheap bottles wrapped in brown paper. Their lives paused somewhere between intoxication and collapse. They saw Johnson first. Everyone in Harlem knew his face, and when they recognized him in the shape of the gun under Bub's coat, they scattered without a word, backing away as if instinct alone told them survival meant disappearing. All except one. Edward Carter sat slumped against the brick wall, a half-empty bottle clutched in his hand. His clothes were torn and stained, his face unshaven. His hands shook from the cold, the alcohol, or both. He was talking loudly, slurring through some story no one was listening to anymore, gesturing wildly with the bottle like it was proof that his life still meant something. He didn't notice the alley emptying, didn't notice the sudden silence. Not until a shadow fell over him. Edward squinted upward, his mind struggling to focus. It took a few seconds for the alcohol-fogged reality to sharpen enough for recognition to hit. When it did, the color drained from his face. He tried to stand, tried to run, His legs failed him. The bottle slipped from his hand and shattered on the ground. Johnson said his name calmly. Just his name. Edward stammered something incoherent, fear cutting through the drunken haze. Johnson reached down, grabbed him by the front of his shirt, and lifted him to his feet with one smooth motion. Edward suddenly understood exactly how serious this was. This wasn't a threat shouted from across the alley. This was the most dangerous man in Harlem, holding him upright and looking directly into his eyes. Johnson didn't yell. He didn't curse. He recited facts instead, quietly, methodically. Edward's mother was 72 years old, 90 pounds at most, living without heat or electricity in February, surviving on $3 a month, starving, freezing, wearing a house dress because she couldn't afford a coat, and 2 nights earlier, Edward had gone to her apartment drunk, demanding money. When she said no, he hit her, knocked her down, stole the only dollar she had left. Edward tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to hide behind the word drunk. Johnson's hand moved faster than Edward could see. The slap echoed through the alley like a gunshot. Edward's head snapped to the side, his lips split open, blood running down his chin. Before he could recover, Johnson pulled him close again, their faces inches apart. That was the warning, the only one. Johnson told him that touching his mother again, raising his voice, asking for money, showing up drunk would end his life, not metaphorically, literally. And Edward understood. This wasn't a performance. This wasn't intimidation for show. This was a line that had been drawn, and crossing it meant he wouldn't survive the next encounter. Edward broke down. Not performative tears, not excuses, real fear, real shame. He said he knew he'd become garbage, that alcohol had destroyed him, that the world had beaten him down until the bottle was the only escape left, and for the first time, instead of dismissing him, Johnson listened. Then Johnson did something unexpected. Instead of finishing him, instead of leaving him broken in the alley, Johnson told Edward to show up the next morning at 6:30 a.m. at Sam's restaurant on 135th Street. Hard labor, honest work, $25 a week, a chance. Not forgiveness, a chance. Edward stared at him in disbelief. A job, real work, something no one had offered him in years. Johnson handed him $10 and told him exactly how to use it to clean himself up, to find a bed, to show up sober. Not for himself, for his mother. And every Friday, $10 from his pay would go straight to her. Miss once, and there would be no second conversation. As Johnson turned to leave the alley, Edward stood shaking, clutching the money like a lifeline, knowing that this was the moment his life either changed or ended. Edward Carter didn't sleep that night. After Bumpy Johnson disappeared into the Harlem streets, the alley felt colder, darker, and unbearably quiet. The $10 bill sat folded in his pocket like something unreal, too much money to waste, too important to lose. His hands shook violently, his body screaming for alcohol, his mind begging for escape. Every instinct he had built over 15 years told him to find another bottle, to drown the fear, to forget the warning that had just been carved into his soul. But the image of his mother's bruised face wouldn't leave him. Neither would the memory of Johnson's voice, calm and absolute, promising consequences that could not be survived. Edward walked, not toward a liquor store, but north, forcing himself step by step away from temptation. He found a public bathhouse on 127th Street and paid 50 cents for hot water and soap. Standing under the steaming spray, he scrubbed his skin raw, watching weeks of dirt, sweat, and despair wash down the drain. The water ran black at first, then gray, then finally clear. For the first time in years, he looked like a human being again. Later that evening, he paid $1 at a barber shop for a shave. As clumps of beard fell to the floor, a stranger slowly emerged in the mirror, thinner, damaged, but recognizable. The face of the man he used to be. He spent $3 on a bed in a flop house on 152nd Street. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't peace. But it was warm, and it had a door that locked. Lying on the thin mattress, Edward stared at the ceiling as his body rebelled. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His muscles cramped. His mind raced with fear, fear that he wouldn't wake up, fear that he'd fail, fear that he'd show up drunk and prove everyone right. By 5:30 a.m., he gave up on sleep entirely. When Edward reached Sam's restaurant at 6:15 a.m., the sky was still dark. He stood outside, shivering, watching through the window as the kitchen came to life, griddles heating, coffee brewing, men moving with purpose. At exactly 6:25, he took a breath and walked in. Sam, a large, gray-haired man with hands shaped by decades of labor, looked up and studied him carefully. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. He simply nodded, as if he'd been expecting this moment. Sam told Edward plainly that what he'd done before didn't matter. Drunk, street life, violence, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was whether he showed up on time, worked hard, and kept his head down. If he failed, he was gone and Bumpy Johnson would hear about it. Edward agreed without hesitation. There was nothing left to argue. This was the line between survival and destruction. The work began immediately. Blocks of ice weighing nearly 100 pounds each had to be carried from a delivery truck to the ice house. Edward's body screamed in protest. His back seized. His arms shook. Each step felt like it might be his last. But he carried every block, resting only long enough to keep from collapsing. Then came sacks of flour and rice, 50 pounds each, hauled one by one to storage. By the time the breakfast rush began, Edward was already soaked in sweat despite the freezing air outside. Dishes piled up endlessly, plates, pots, grease-covered pans. His hands blistered, his legs burned. By noon, tears mixed with sweat as he stood over the sink, his mind whispering that death would be easier than this. But every time that thought surfaced, another followed his mother alone in her apartment, and Bumpy Johnson's promise of what would happen if he quit. When Sam told him his shift was over at 3:30 p.m., Edward could barely stand, but he had done it. He hadn't run. He hadn't begged. He hadn't reached for a bottle. He had survived the first day, and as he stepped back out into the cold Harlem air, exhausted and broken, Edward understood something for the first time in years. Staying alive was harder than drinking himself to death, but it was still possible. Edward showed up the next morning at 6:30 a.m., and the morning after that, and the one after that. Every single day, his body protested harder than his mind ever had. His hands were wrapped in cloth to protect the raw blisters. His feet throbbed from standing 10 hours straight. His back ached constantly, and beneath all of it, the craving for alcohol never disappeared. It whispered to him during breaks, during exhaustion, during moments when quitting felt easier than continuing. But fear was stronger. Not just fear of punishment, but fear of becoming the man who hit his own mother ever again. By the end of the first week, something changed. The blisters hardened into calluses. His hands stopped shaking. His movements became steadier. His body began remembering what work felt like. On Friday afternoon, Sam called him into the small office in the back. Without ceremony, he handed Edward an envelope. $25. Cash. Money earned honestly for the first time in more than a decade. Edward stared at it, overwhelmed not by the amount, but by what it represented. Proof that he could still function. Proof that he hadn't completely destroyed himself. Edward didn't celebrate. He didn't stop anywhere. He walked straight to 347 West 134th Street and climbed the stairs slowly, rehearsing what he would say. When he knocked, his mother's voice came through the door, hesitant, afraid. When she opened it, she froze. Standing in front of her wasn't the drunk who had hurt her, it was her son, clean, sober, eyes clear. Edward handed her $10 and told her about the job, told her he would bring $10 every Friday. No excuse, no exceptions. And then, for the first time in years, he apologized not to escape guilt, but to accept it. Elizabeth took the money with trembling hands and hugged him, really hugged him. The kind of embrace that carries grief, hope, and forgiveness all at once. And from that moment on, Fridays became sacred. Week after week, Edward showed up at work. Month after month, he stayed sober not because the urge vanished, but because the cost of failure was too high. Every Friday, At exactly 4 o'clock, he brought $10 to his mother. Slowly, her apartment changed. Heat stayed on, food stayed stocked, fear disappeared, and Edward changed too. His posture straightened, his voice steadied, his shame softened into responsibility. Years passed. Edward didn't miss a single day of work. Sam promoted him, his pay increased. He moved out of flophouses into his own place. But no matter how much he earned, $10 still went to his mother every Friday. When Elizabeth fell ill years later, Edward was there every night, sitting beside her bed, feeding her soup, holding her hand. She didn't die hungry. She didn't die cold. She died knowing her son had come back. At her funeral, years after that frozen afternoon in 1947, Edward noticed a familiar figure standing quietly in the back, Bumpy Johnson. No speeches, no recognition, just a nod. That was enough. Edward went on to live a quiet, decent life. He never drank again, never raised his hand to anyone. Every year, on February 4th, he left an envelope at the Palm Cafe with a simple note and a small sum of money. Gratitude, repaid in the only way he could. Because some debts can never be erased, only honored. Years later, people in Harlem would still whisper about that frozen afternoon in 1947, not because it involved violence, not because blood was spilled, but because it revealed something far more unsettling: how thin the line is between destruction and redemption, and how rarely anyone is willing to step in when someone stands on that edge. An elderly woman, starving and freezing, had stood in the middle of the street and stopped the most feared man in the neighborhood. She didn't ask for justice. She didn't ask for revenge. She asked for bread, and in doing so, she unknowingly set off a chain of events that saved 2 lives. Elizabeth Carter lived her final years with heat in her apartment, food on her table, and dignity restored. Her son lived the rest of his life sober, working, and present something that once seemed impossible. And the man who made it happen never took credit, never told the story himself, never asked to be remembered for it. In a city hardened by poverty, racism, and crime, this quiet act of intervention became something rare, a moment where fear gave way to responsibility and power was used not to destroy, but to correct. Harlem moved on, as cities always do. Buildings changed, streets changed, names faded. But every February 4th, a small envelope appeared at the Palm Cafe, a silent reminder that sometimes history isn't shaped by gunshots or headlines, but by a single decision made in the cold, when someone chooses to help instead of walking past. Because in the end, this was never really a story about a gangster. It was a story about a mother, a son, and the moment someone finally refused to let them disappear,